About 5 years ago, I met a brother and a sister named Michael and Victoria. They were a 7th grader and a 6th grader at the time back out in Missouri. And they were difficult kids, really difficult. They were super walled off, disrespectful, didn't do well in school, in trouble all of the time kind of kids. And I do have their permission to share a little bit of their story with you, just so you know. But they were the type of kids that you just knew something was going on behind the scenes. You just knew there was a lot of hurt in their story, and I desperately wanted to help them. So Janie and I kind of took them in, made them a part of our lives, and over the years, we had them over a lot, and the church helped pay for them to go to camps and things, and slowly over time, they started opening up to us a little bit, and they never got to know their dad. He was in prison from the time they were tiny. The first stepdad that became a part of their lives brought with him 2 teenage sons when they were 4 and 5 years old. And those 2 teenage sons, the stepdad brought in, sexually abused both of them for the next 4 years until mom finally decided to leave. Then the second stepdad that became a part of their lives was physically abusive to Michael and their mom. He would hit both of them and push them around. And he was verbally, emotionally abusive with Victoria. He would tell her that she was fat, tell her that she was worthless. And if you ever met that girl, that couldn't have been farther from the truth, but that stuck with her. And now that Janie and I are finally a part of their lives and the most stable and consistent adult relationships that they've ever had, they came to us pretty quick when mom was allowing yet another boyfriend to move in the house with them. And over the last couple of years, it seems like this guy has actually turned out to be a pretty decent guy so far as I can tell. But naturally, when this was happening, they were really nervous and wanted somebody to talk to about it. So over the years, as some of these things and a whole lot of other things came out, as they spent time with Janie and I in our home, I just had this realization that we can't help these kids. Actually, nobody's going to be able to help these kids. No amount of therapy, no amount of stability, no amount of money, relationships, or whatever is going to heal these wounds in a way that's going to lead to permanent life change for these kids. The only thing that's going to be able to help them is the hope, healing, and purpose that comes from the gospel of Jesus Christ. But that led me to a really uncomfortable realization. They've been a part of my group for a couple of years now. And I don't know that I've ever actually explicitly, with words, shared the gospel with them. I've been doing all of the good and healthy things for them to try to help them, except the one thing that's going to make a difference in their lives. And I'm a pastor. So let me preface everything else that I'm going to say this morning with, I get it. And sharing the gospel isn't easy, but it is really simple because for every Michael and Victoria I have the privilege of knowing personally, there are thousands more, and they all desperately need this. All right, we're wrapping up our series this morning, just like Corey said, called Jesus First. We've been walking through the book of Colossians and pulling out a few major themes that we find in there. In the first week, we talked about the supremacy of Jesus, how Jesus is greater than everything else. And since he is greater than everything else, week 2, we talked about how he wants to be first place in your life. Last week, Corey talked about how when Jesus is first place in our lives, what should that look like? What is of first importance? How can we love people well? And this morning, we're going to talk about how we get to share this Jesus firsthand with other people. The last week and this morning are kind of where the rubber meets the road from the first 2 weeks. If Jesus really is greater than everything else, if he is first place in your life, then we should love people. There is no better way to express that love for people than to share with them firsthand the gospel, the hope that we have. 1 Peter 3:15 talks about this. It says, "But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks for the reason for the hope that you have." And notice that it doesn't say you have to give a full explanation of the gospel to everyone who asks. Notice that it doesn't say you have to convince them that everything in the Bible is even true. Notice it doesn't say you have to drag them to church with you. You can do all of those things. But what it does say is that everyone, not just pastors, not just people who have been Christians for a long time, everyone needs to always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that we have. That's simply sharing the good news about Jesus firsthand from my own life. But I get it. It's really not easy because there's some problems, some very real hurdles that we have with that. Let me just walk through a couple of those, my own hesitations that I've had and continue to have, and maybe you felt this way too. I'm scared. I'm intimidated by this concept of sharing the gospel, telling people the good news about Jesus. That sounds really big and important. I'm scared that they won't listen. I'm scared that I'll screw it up and somehow push them farther away from God. I'm scared that I don't know enough of the Bible to answer all of their questions. And beyond those insecurities, sometimes I just feel like I don't have a perfect opportunity. That the timing has never presented itself in an obvious way to me. And sometimes I even think that this will just happen. It's the job of the church or the pastor. And yes, that does apply to me. So how that thinking has crept its way into my life is that, well, if I just get them to come to church with me or be a part of my group and they hear me talk about Jesus in that context, maybe that'll be sufficient. Maybe it'll just rub off on them. Spoiler alert, that does not usually work very well, but I'll get to that in just a second. But there are real reasons that we have a hard time sharing the gospel, the good news. I'm not trying to make anyone in here feel bad about this because I get it. It's not easy, but thank God it's simple because not only do Michael and Victoria's eternities depend on hearing this, their whole lives do too. Because let's be real, I care about those kids. But if I want them to get out of their situation, if I want them to escape poverty, if I want them to get out of cyclical abuse, if I want them to start families of their own and raise kids that don't have the same struggles that they had, they need the hope, purpose, and healing that is offered by the gospel of Jesus Christ. And if I genuinely care about them, the best way that I can express that is to tell them. And hoping that they just show up at church and it rubs off on them isn't going to cut it. And unfortunately, there is proof of that. Do you guys know the average cost of a baptism in the United States? Like if you were to take all of the money that the church in America raises and then divide it by the total number of baptisms that happened in the United States last year, do you know what that number comes out to? Any guesses? Go ahead, throw one out. $1.5 million. That's our national average of how expensive it is to baptize per person in the United States. Now, that number can be skewed by a lot of churches, but that's not a hard formula to follow for us here. Something about that just doesn't quite feel right. Now, bear with me for just a quick second while I round out some numbers, because depending on what research you use, it's a little bit different, but between 9 and 11% of Colorado Springs are practicing Christians. And we're in the middle of some explosive population growth right now, so this number is a little hard to track. But if you were to say 600,000 people were living in this city right now, and 10% of them are practicing Christians, that's going to be about accurate. That leaves you with 60,000 people in this city who are followers of Jesus, practicing followers of Jesus. But that leaves 540,000 people who are not yet following Jesus. And Barna did some research just a couple of years ago that essentially showed that the church, nationwide in America, the church has not grown or shrank measurably by percentage of the population since the 1950s. As in the last 70 years, The church has not grown or shrank by a measure of a percentage of the population, right? As in what we have been doing for the last 70 years has been effective, right? There are more people in the church today than there were in the 1950s, but our population has also grown, which means there's also more people who are not following Jesus today than in the 1950s. Just maintaining our percentage of the population is not going to be effective enough to win this city, right? 10% of 1,000 people leaves 900 people not following Jesus. If we get to 1 million people in this city, like we're supposed to within the next decade, that'll leave 900,000 people not following Jesus. Maintaining a percentage of the population means we're losing ground. And I love the church. I love the church nationwide. I love this church here. I love what we're doing. But what we are doing by itself is not going to be effective enough to win this city for Jesus. And every one of those 540,000 people's eternities and their whole lives depend on hearing the gospel. One more stat that I know Corey has shared here before. The average Christian in America explicitly with words shares the gospel one time every 26 years. And by the gospel, I mean the good news, the meta-narrative of the whole Bible, right? That the world is broken, we see that, but God didn't intend it to be that way. In fact, he created the world and us perfect, in perfect unity with him, but in our sin, in our rebellion, we have left God's perfect plan and contributed to the brokenness that we see in this world. But thankfully, God sent his son, Jesus, who became fully man, died on the cross, took our penalty on himself, and then raised again from the dead. And now through him, if we are willing to turn from our rebellion, trust in Jesus as our Savior, make him Lord of our lives, we can be restored as a new creation again, back into this perfection that God intended. That's the gospel. That's the whole story of the Bible that the Bible's telling us in a lot more detail. But one time saying that every 26 years is not going to win our city. All right, but enough of the bad news, because I'm not really a bad news person, but we get this. You're following me, right? There's a problem. All right, 540,000 people who need Jesus, some of them just like Michael and Victoria. I care about them. I want them to spend eternity with Jesus, and I want their lives to be better today too. So I need to share the gospel. I need them to have an opportunity to respond, but there's hurdles that we have to that, legitimate ones that make this hard. So what are we going to do about that? I want to show how simple this can really be by just jumping into our D1 time this morning. All right, here in just a second, we're going to group up around the tables. Every week in this series, we've been doing a D1 time. We've been taking it a chapter at a time, reading that chapter together, and then kind of sharing with each other some thoughts that have come up. This time, instead of reading the whole chapter, I just want to focus in on verses 2 through 6. The rest of the chapter is actually super interesting. It kind of shows Paul's network of people that he has out sharing in his ministry. But in verses 2 through 6, Paul lays out a strategy that we can follow for sharing the gospel. All right, so let's take just 4 minutes right now, and let's group up. Let's read Colossians 4, 2 through 6, and share a thought or something that stuck out to you around your tables. It's hard for me to pick out just one verse from this section because every hesitation and every excuse that I've ever had, Paul addresses in these 5 simple verses. Paul just lays out God's brilliantly simple plan for changing the world through us. And so I just want to dive into these verses this morning and pull out some wisdom from Paul. Let's just jump in right at verse 2. He says, "Devote yourselves to prayer with an alert mind and a thankful heart. Pray for us too, that God will give us many opportunities to speak about his mysterious plan concerning Christ." Devote yourselves to prayer. That's the very first thing. If we want people to know about who Jesus is, we have to pray. We have to pray for opportunities to speak about this. The best example I have of this in my own life is my wife Janie's grandma, Carol Weiss. She works at a Chick-fil-A in Joplin, Missouri, and she's encouraged us with this many, many times because she repeats stories, but that's okay because I need to hear it over and over again. She's encouraged us with the fact that she, on her drive-in every single morning, prays the exact same prayer. She prays, "Jesus, give me an opportunity today to show somebody that you love them." Right? That's this prayer. And what she's encouraged us with is the fact that there's already opportunities. Right? We know that. There are opportunities to share the love of Jesus with people every single day, but her praying that has caused her to open her eyes. It sets her focus. It sets her expectations. Now she's looking for it. She's expecting it to happen, anticipating God to answer, because when you pray for something that you know is in the will of God, like it's in God's will that people hear, and it's God's will that we share, right? You should be expecting an answer. We should be paying attention. We should have an alert mind. We should be watchful, some other translations put it. Why should we be watchful? Because if we ask for opportunities, I promise you, opportunities are going to show up. In preparation for today, I prayed this prayer last Monday. That was a huge mistake because not once, not twice, but 3 times an opportunity this week presented itself. And I was kind of busy, but Monday evening, right, not even 12 hours after I prayed that prayer, I got a text from an old student that I hadn't seen in a really long time. He was one of those kids that kind of started disappearing his junior and his senior year, didn't see him as much, and then he went off to college. Not 3 messages back and forth with this kid, I realized that he is having a really hard time being away from home at school in Nebraska. And if that's not an opportunity to check in on his relationship with Jesus, I don't know what is. So I thanked God for that. I thank God for my opportunity to reconnect with Darius a little bit. I thanked God for the great little sermon illustration I got out of it. Win-win. I thought I was done. That was great. And then Tuesday came. And I got another text from a kid that I knew, an old friend of mine from high school from here, wanting to hang out that night. And I texted back to him. I said, I don't know, man. Honestly, I'm kind of busy this week. We've got a lot of stuff going on, and I'm having to prep for a sermon, so I don't think I'll be able to make it. I sent that off. And then I finished the statement in my head. I have a sermon to prep this week about sharing the love of Jesus to people who need it. So as the conviction set in a little bit, I just sent him another text. Actually, I'll be able to figure it out. Like we can hang out tonight. That's fine. So we did, and then Wednesday came, and a group of 15 pastors from around Colorado Springs showed up here at Sunnyside for a training on, guess what? Simple ways to share the gospel. It's as if God knows how many reminders I need because sometimes I'm stupid. But in the middle of this training, the leader did a crazy thing, a little ridiculous. He dismissed 15 pastors to go out and actually share the gospel with people. Anybody? And I'm sitting here, I'm literally like so excited. I'm taking notes. This is so much fun. I'm loving this opportunity to think about sharing the gospel. And then he says that, and I'm sitting there like, I didn't actually want to go talk to anybody. All right, you guys got a horrible youth pastor. I don't know. There's no way around it. I'm sorry, but that's what was going through my mind. But then it occurred to me, right? Janie and I actually just recently bought a house. We haven't moved in yet. We have some work we need to do on it, but we haven't met any of our neighbors yet. It's right up the street. So Corey and I went up the street to our house thinking like, let's see if any of our neighbors are home at noon. Doubt it. I was hoping we'd just not find anybody. Lo and behold, there's some guy out in his garage just like standing there. Like, well, okay. So we walk down to him, and I'm feeling super uncomfortable about this because I'm not good with strangers that much. And I walk up to him and I say, hey, we just bought this house, standing there with Corey. And then I immediately heard it the way he must have heard it. And I was like, well, no, my wife and I just bought this house. This is my friend. Anyway, I had to clear all of that up before we could continue. And I say, like, hey, is there any way we can pray for you? But this wasn't just any neighbor. This neighbor grew up on that street in the house right across the street, and his parents still live there. He's about my age, and he knows the names of every single person on our little road. And Corey and I walked away from that like, man, what a great person for us to have met. Like, what a great inn for my entire little cul-de-sac. Right? We walked away from that knowing that was a truly divine appointment. And I'll say it again, if you pray for something that you know is in the will of God, pay attention because opportunities are going to come. And sometimes, apparently, God might even shove them down your throat when you don't actually want them. But I digress because we need to keep going, all right? This is why I am here in chains. Pray that I will proclaim this message as clearly as I should. This is Paul's story. This is the state that he's in right now. And we see this over and over and over again in Paul's writings. He simplifies this telling of the gospel, the good news about Jesus, by using his own life. You want to know how to tell people the good news about Jesus? Tell them how the good news has changed you. Often he uses this really simple formula that we could boil down to like 15 seconds or less. It says, there was a time in my life when blank, but recently God has been teaching me blank, and then follow that up with some form of a question, get some way to throw that back into their court, see if they want to hear more. Think about when Paul was writing to Timothy. He says, I was the worst of sinners. I was killing people, but God showed me mercy, so that everyone in the world, no matter what they've done in their past, knows that they can have it too. This is so simple. This is so repeatable. Because when you catch something in a person's story, you can immediately try to relate it to your own. And you can say the same thing every single time. Michael, the kid I was telling you about before, he struggled a lot with authority in his life. He did not do well being told what to do. He would constantly get angry and blow up because he felt like people didn't understand him and what he was going through. So he's in trouble constantly at school, had a really hard time. That's understandable if you just look at the awful list of father figures that he's had parade through his life. But I distinctly remember having this type of conversation with him at one point. Dude, I used to have a major problem with anger. Actually, my whole family does. But over the past few years, because of the work of the Holy Spirit in my life, I have been able to learn patience, which is really lucky for you because you test it a lot. But I think that that's something you can learn too. Like, do you want that? And I missed an opportunity with his sister Victoria because she had struggles with self-worth and defining her by all of the wrong things, relationships, her looks, and so on. And I could have so easily said to her, because this is true, Victoria, there was a time in my life when all I cared about was what other people thought of me. And I got my value from being good in school, being intelligent, being a good athlete, being good at my job, whatever it was. And every single one of those things eventually left me feeling empty. They all failed me. But recently, God has been teaching me how much he cares about me, that he calls me his masterpiece, that he has set me apart for a special and specific purpose. Victoria, have you ever felt valued like that? Because I know God feels the exact same way about you. It doesn't take long. It's simple. If we want people to understand the power of the gospel, tell them how it affected your life, but always follow up with a question. Get the ball back in their court. Make them make a decision on whether or not they want you to tell them God's story. Hey, I'm telling you this firsthand from my own life. Has anything like this ever happened to you? And now we have an opportunity to tell them the hope that we have in Jesus. It takes 15 seconds or less to see if somebody wants to hear more. And it's not even that awkward. You're just sharing a good story from your own life. Then in verse 5 and 6, Paul tells us about the attitude that we should carry when we do this. He says, live wisely among those who are not believers and make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversations be gracious and attractive so that you will have the right response for everyone. Here's the thing. I know some Christians have left a really bad taste in people's mouths because of how they've gone about trying to evangelize the world. And if you're anything like me, you worry about pushing someone farther away from God. Here's the reality, though. It's not possible to push somebody farther away from God. All right, the Bible teaches us that we are all completely removed from God. That is the consequence of sin in our lives, is perfect and complete separation from God. That's every one of our realities before we accept Jesus. You are not going to make that worse by poorly stumbling through an attempt at telling them how Jesus changed your life. And what we can do if we don't heed Paul's advice here by being gracious and having a right response, having wisdom, we can maybe harden somebody's heart, make it more difficult for them to even want to hear more. All right, that's why we need to be gracious and kind in our conversations and not push people away when they clearly don't want to hear more. Sometimes doors are just going to be closed, and that's okay. Because Jesus experienced that too. But there are two aspects to this part, making the most of every opportunity, and that's availability and intentionality. Availability, because the fact is, I can't share the good news of Jesus with people in my life if I don't have any margin in my life. Right? As Americans, this is hard. We're constantly rushing from thing to thing, making sure our kids have every opportunity they could possibly think of or ever want. Working extra hours trying to get ahead. We're constantly moving, but life-changing relationships take time. Also, it's really hard to share with people if we don't know anybody who's not following Jesus. There's 540,000 of them in this city, but are we practicing proximity to people who are not yet following Jesus? Have we ever met our neighbors like I hadn't, or asked anybody at work, do we know people who need Jesus, and do we have time for them? Because I get it, it's really not easy. And it's super easy to get overwhelmed by 540,000 people, right? I don't have time to reach all of those people, most of whom I don't even know, but that's not the point. Right? The college that I attended had this slogan they like to throw around, just one. And this is a sermon that I know has been preached here before. Who is your one? You don't have to reach everyone. But what if this year you reached just one person not yet following Jesus? What if you made time for, created margin for your one, to the point where if they called you, you could drop what it is you were doing and be with them? Do you even know one person? If everyone who came to church here today did that, and next year did it again, and their ones actually did that and made making disciples like that a priority, this church by itself would reach 600,000 people in 11 years. That's wildly outpacing our projected population growth. But if every Christian in Colorado Springs, not just our church, did that, if every Christian in the Springs made making disciples a priority like that, we would actually run out of people to talk to in 4 years. Availability, we need to make time. But then we also need to be intentional. You see, Janie and I, we were really good at being available to Michael and Victoria. We had them over at our house a lot. But we were just waiting for them to ask us questions. And sometimes they did, like they thought it was weird that we sat down to meals together. Right? They thought it was weird that we weren't constantly shouting at each other, that I was affectionate with Janie and with Asa. Like these are things that I wanted them to absorb from us in our home. Right? But we were just waiting for them to ask questions. And sometimes they did. Like I said, that's the 1 Peter passage. Be prepared to give an answer. But we are the ones that have the hope. Why aren't we acting like that? We are the ones that have experienced the work of the Holy Spirit in our own lives, changing us. Why on earth am I waiting for them to come to me? I need to talk to them. I need to share the gospel with them because I need them to have an opportunity to respond. I did not have any sense of urgency. I was taking the slow and steady approach, which is wise, right, with these kids. I did not have any sense of urgency in talking to them, having real conversations with them until Michael attempted suicide one Wednesday. He took a brand new whole bottle of prescriptions all at once. His sister, Victoria, was actually the one that found him. She called their mom. They went to the hospital. Victoria was alone, so she walked down to the church to tell me what had happened. That was a slap in the face moment for me. And if I really care about these two, if I care about their eternity, but also what they're dealing with right now, I have got to be more intentional. And I was this close to missing my chance. Finally, I was more intentional after that. I had more conversations with them, but I wish I could tell you that this story ends in a couple of baptisms. But it doesn't. Which I think actually really hits at my biggest hurdle to sharing. What if I'm not successful? What if they don't accept it, which I think just betrays my misunderstanding of our responsibility in this? Because it's not my job to convert people. That's the Holy Spirit's work in their life. My responsibility in this is to be obedient to what the Spirit is telling me to do in every moment. Now, sometimes the Spirit might be telling me, like, you need to share with this person. And if I share, that was a success right there. Sometimes the Spirit might be telling me in the midst of a friend who's grieving, might be telling me, no, you just need to be present right now. Maybe right now they don't need some trite Christianese saying, they just need me to be there. And that conversation can happen later. But if I'm being obedient to what the Spirit is prompting me to do in that moment, I am being successful. I am doing what it is God is calling me to do. So no, their stories don't end in a baptism, but just this past year, I got to preach at our church at Easter. And part of that Easter service was actually a video of Michael and Victoria sharing some of their story. And while they didn't profess Jesus as Lord of their lives yet, I'm still hopeful, Victoria did say things like, oh, when I feel bad about myself, I know I can talk to God because I know He'll listen. And I know that if I go to church, I can find people who will build me up. Michael said a few things like when he feels hopeless, he knows that he's seen. He reminds himself that at least in God's eyes, he's not a complete screw-up. As heartbreaking as that statement is, I can see the hope of the gospel taking root in their lives. And even though it isn't finished, I know that I was obedient to what God was calling me to do with them. And now my prayer is that somebody else out there will water that seed for me. I pray that God will send somebody to them that will be obedient, because not only do their eternities depend on this, their whole lives do too. This is as simple as Paul lays it out for us. Pray. Pray for opportunities. Pray for clarity. And then look, pay attention, be watchful. Look for those opportunities because they're going to come, and make the most of those opportunities, and then share firsthand the hope that we have by sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's it. That's really all it is. So I want to practice that this morning. I'm going to do the thing that I hated this week to you. So I want to get together at our tables. We're going to go into another table talk time, and we're going to practice this. It's going to be super weird. I love it. All right. But what I want to do is I want to talk about together, who is our one? Who is the one person that God is putting on your heart to reach this year? If you don't know who that is, that's fine. Let's take a quick second and pray. Ask God for clarity. God, make it obvious to me in the next couple of weeks who it is you want me to make time for in my life to reach. And then let's practice how simple it can be to share my story, right? Share how the gospel is working in me. Practice this statement if you need to. There was a time in my life when blank, but recently God has been teaching me blank. And then come up with some sort of a question, to throw that back into their court. Has anything like that ever happened to you? Do you want to hear more? Whatever that is, have some sort of a question to make them have a response to you. And then maybe at the end, just have one person at your table pray. Pray for opportunities that they come, that you can be available and intentional. Pray for clarity, pray for wisdom, pray for graciousness. This is Paul's formula: pray, look, and share. All right, so I want to practice that this morning. So let's clump up a little bit more than normal. Let's try to find more than just two people to talk to around your tables. Let's move around and just embrace the weirdness of it. I had to, so I'm going to make you do it too. It's fine. But we're the ones. We are the ones that have the hope of Jesus Christ. Right, there are so many people right in our own backyard that desperately need it. And I get it. It's not easy, but it really is that simple. So let's practice that together right now.